Man.
Welcome, everybody, to our first research conversation of the academic year, and we're very pleased to have this going again. I'm here along with Associate Dean Shola Adesope and Faculty Research Development Coordinator Laura Girardeau, and we've put together this research conversation series meant to spawn ideas, to acquaint people with what people are doing in the college. Oftentimes we're so busy we don't have time to be sitting and listening to people, but we think that it's good to do this at a lunchtime, 50 minutes, get an idea what Johnny or Ann Cox or anyone else is thinking about.
Oh boy.
So today we are going to have Johnny Lupinacci, who's an associate professor in cultural studies and social thought and education, talk about scholar-activism research as praxis in support of democracy in dangerous times. Lupinacci talks about how research is all political, and I think that's something that we'll be delving into in this conversation. He discusses the importance of scholar activism because he thinks that is important for himself, but also for the people that he teaches. John Lupinacci has been here since 2013. He's a person that works in the interdisciplinary ecocritical work in education, drawing from critical social theory, anarchist philosophy, critical animal studies, ecofeminist philosophy, and eco-justice education. He also recognizes that many Western frameworks are entangled with colonial cultures and thus ought not to take precedence or appropriate diverse indigenous knowledges. He's an experienced high school teacher, a scholar, a very productive researcher, and a wonderful colleague, my close colleague, John Lupinacci. Johnny, go for it.
All right, thank you, AG. And let me do a screen share so we can do the sort of obligatory presentation PowerPoint. Let's see, did it work here? I think we can go that. Okay. So hello and welcome today to this conversation. And as AG introed, really it's more of what I'd like to say is a praxis session, because we'll be having a discussion centered, yes, on scholar activism and positioning research as praxis in support of democracy. If I can break that down today briefly, I will simplify it into two very important concepts to a healthy democracy. The first, diversity, and the second, praxis. When it comes to complex political matters, and I'd like to note explicitly that all research is political, I find it helpful to approach these sessions with having an open-ended and hopefully informative dialogue in regards to doing research at the same time as the largest social and environmental uprising of all of our lifetimes is going on. But more so, my goal for what we share here today is for this to be one of many points of connection for scholarly community building and an authentic invitation to learn and grow together wherever we are at in this kind of work and however we identify as researchers. Before I get into the conversation and introducing myself, there are some important concepts for considering the political responsibilities of education researchers in this moment, like the undeniable importance of addressing systemic racism and how racism is deeply embedded in our schools and communities in connection with the undeniable atrocities of poverty, sexism, ableism, speciesism, and the interrelated nature of these forms of oppression with climate change. But given such stark conditions, there is hope. And so I'll begin with gratitude. And I'd like to thank deeply the organizers of this forum, and include in that thank you, I'd like to recognize the incredible supportive leadership from friends and accomplices in justice work. And they're here today organizing this. Shola, AG, Laura, thank you. And to all the folks who are here going to incredible lengths to keep this kind of mission-driven programming thriving in our college, thank you. These sessions are not only an enrichment to an already robust curriculum and professional commitment of WSU, but they help us deeply examine and critically analyze what it means to be learners leading learners, right? And to collaborate with diverse communities towards sustainable and just futures. This is the mission of our college, and I'm pretty grateful to be with you all. So thank you, organizers, and thank you those attending on Zoom, and to anybody who watches this recording, thank you too. So I hope this critical dialogue ignites ideas and that get shared throughout our professional growth together as researchers, because it's together that we can and ought to be in dialogue that focuses on how we make our communities better places for everyone, and how a more beautiful, happier, healthier region and world begins each day with you and me, and with what we all do with intention and attention to ending the kind of educational beliefs and practices in schools that contribute to racial injustice, the spread of disease, poverty, and the many ways that violences of oppression are woven into all of our lives. So as researchers, or dare we call ourselves scholar activist educators that do research as praxis, if we share a desire to see change, then we brace ourselves for the difficulty and dangers of these changes in current times, and together we work responsibly to make change happen. In solidarity with such an effort, I'd like to start with expressing my utmost gratitude for the indigenous people of the lands on which, no matter where we are zooming from on this planet, we are all on indigenous land. And for any of us here, while we ourselves may not be indigenous to these lands, it's important that we recognize our privilege to have these critical conversations. And with that, we recognize that diverse indigenous peoples around the world have survived and continue to endure genocide, both on this continent and abroad, and that beyond customary land acknowledgements that we've gotten really good at, we must continue to work towards decolonial futures as we do this work. Furthermore, as we talk today about work around our teaching, research, our service, and really through us being educational researchers at WSU, I hope that our work reaches out across state borders. It works locally and more broadly, and will hopefully make unique and local connections here among one another with how we'll reimagine our pedagogical and research practices together through a praxis of honoring diversity and the importance of human rights as well as ecological well-being in times where there are some loud voices and violent actions being taken by climate change deniers, anti-vaxxers, human and white supremacists, police, misogynists, and in general, folks I feel are often misled or misinformed to the importance of diversity. Diversity, toggle here between my notes, is a condition of difference upon which everything exists. I love short foundational philosophical definitions. Diversity is a condition of difference upon which everything exists. Given the political moment of 2020 and 2021, I take the position that we as education researchers ought to be working on all fronts to ensure that schools become places of sanctuary from injustice and sites where all our children are learning to be in communities that are just and sustainable democracies. A day doesn't go by that I don't hear directly from teachers or peer researchers that there is a chilling effect in our schools or in our work right now. And they ask, Johnny, don't you think things are too polarized or that we ought to be more neutral? And I simply have to quote the historian Howard Zinn and say, you can't be neutral on a moving train. Zinn in the 1960s, amidst the civil rights movement, explained to his students, you can't ride the train and then say you have no idea how you arrived at the destination. You're either on board or you're not. You can't be neutral. At a similar moment in 1963, James Baldwin, addressing teachers and school leaders in a talk to teachers, said, this is a quote, "Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. We are in a revolutionary situation, no matter how unpopular the world has become in this country. The society in which we live is desperately menaced from within. To any citizen of this country who figures themselves as responsible, and particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke. Or to put another way, you must understand that in the attempt to correct so many generations of bad faith and cruelty, when it is operating not only in the classroom, but in society, you will be met with the most fantastic, brutal, and determined resistance, end quote. Therefore, you simply cannot in this moment be a researcher and not acknowledge this tremendous power, privilege, and responsibility we have in bringing our best for humanity, and as Baldwin put, going for broke in this moment. And I'll come back to Baldwin to close because I think it's incredibly timely and important for this topic. But I'll center back on gratitude. I hope that we can recognize that among us today, there are diverse allies and accomplices here and across many cultures, and that there are also many missing from being here with us, and that we express our gratitude for those who leverage their lives and freedoms to take direct action and dissent against the cruelty of disease, war, mass incarceration, criminal injustice, climate change, police brutality, and the multitude of ways that colonization, slavery, and racism combine with sexism, classism, and ableism, and root themselves in human supremacies, fuel the unjust suffering of oppressions that fester at the roots of our human hubris in regards to how we treat ourselves, one another, and respond to climate change. So I'm here to ask, how might our diverse research interests, skills, and inquiries contribute to collaboratively addressing, alleviating, and eliminating, wherever possible, unjust suffering? And I'll put that more simply. How might we as researchers help on all fronts toward making our communities kinder and more just through education and sharing not only knowledge, but compassion as we work on our praxis together to recognize and value diversity? So I'm going to define a few things. For the most part, praxis and diversity. But let me do a little bit of an introduction and then on to definitions, and then share some takeaways from the research I'm grateful to be doing. And then we'll move to the best part, the dialogue. I think I got a good enough introduction from Dr. Rudd, and I'm going to skip past to expedite to the conversation. And I feel like just at a glance, I know most of you also, you know that our identities and our relationship to not only what we research, but how we research is deeply intimate and important to this work. And so I hope we get to learn more about each other. But since I think I know everybody here, I can skip past the brief history of how did I come to this work and get right to it. Overall, as a researcher, and when Dr. Rudd and everyone said, come do a research talk and just talk about what you're thinking about, I thought, oh dear, if you're going to give me the mic for a half hour to talk about what I'm thinking about, it's going to be all over the place. So I boil it down to some key guiding questions. I ask, what is the role of education in our society? Then furthermore, I ask what ought to be the role of education? And I add into that who benefits and who suffers, and I'll add who suffers unjustly in our schools. Okay, this is fundamental. And let me tell you, probably most of you know here today or alluded to in this particular moment, but also deeply historically, it's sad that we needn't look too far to see suffering and unjust suffering in our schools, right? And that, as Baldwin noted, this is not only happening in our classrooms, but it's happening in society and vice versa. I mentioned something before about diversity and definitions, and it's important to have some shared working definitions for any learning together or any questioning or any dialogue. And it doesn't mean that these are fixed or perfect, but they help us to push a little where theory and praxis come together to make change. Also known in our craft as praxis, the intentional fusion of theory with practice, praxis. So shall we? I like to say often that, again, repeating myself, diversity is a condition of difference upon which everything exists. Nothing comes into its existence outside of its relationship to something else. This means diversity, as I mentioned before, is a condition of survival. And beyond that, our human health relies on it. We must have strong biodiversity and cultural diversity for many reasons. We must also have this diversity so as not to monoculturalize, because as languages, rituals, beliefs, understandings, and knowledges are lost, so is diversity. And this directly threatens a fundamental condition we ought to be valuing with extreme care. So defining praxis and diversity, and specifically at this moment, the largest social uprising in all of our lifetime, with brilliant leadership from civil rights leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement and the resistance to climate change or response to climate change, water protectors and of the same like. But when we think about our research, the part of the case I'm here to kind of have a discussion around is how do we build from our knowledge and definitions of things to really carefully examine the role schools and our classrooms play in shaping the societies that we live in? Really more specifically, how do we learn to be in community with one another? How do we let go of some of the hubris that we know how to do this one way and embrace the importance of diversity and explore diverse, wise ways of doing so? So I think you can imagine that we deeply examine how racism is learned in our schools and our societies. We deeply examine how sexism is learned and enacted in our societies, and how these isms kind of work together in interrelated ways to undermine justice efforts, really to sort of take the ground out from underneath us as learners, where we can maybe at best hear about these things and learn to talk, but really struggle when it comes to walking the walk. So here we are. And the schools where we teach and many of us conduct our research are spaces. I don't know how my thing is going, sorry. So here we are, and we're in schools and we conduct research. Where we conduct research are spaces or have spaces of interest. They're places where systemic racism, systemic oppression is occurring. And this often includes our research practices. So while I'm working in research, I use a few kind of key tools, overarching, and I'm going to share those. And I use them to visualize what I refer to as two important concepts offered in this work from pretty much ecofeminism. The first is a logic of domination, where I contrast human-centered worldviews with ecological worldviews. And let me share that image. It's often appearing in research work that I share. Okay. I put side by side an ecological understanding and a human-centered worldview, both in research design and research. I'm not sure how I'm working my computer. There's some function I don't know about that's skipping ahead. It's kind of nice. I just wish I knew how to do it and look at my notes. But really important to this is sort of juxtaposing the two worldviews. All right. And in class, whether it's working with teachers or designing research or doing a critical discourse analysis of classroom practices or interview transcriptions or kind of qualitatively collected data, I'm constantly asking, how are we working through understanding the logic structures of deep assumptions? Do we understand and see the world through a human-centered worldview or human supremacist worldview or an ecological understanding, which includes in it, I don't want to appropriate or introduce this as new, includes in it really wise ways from mature cultures or indigenous contributions from around the world that don't situate and center the human as separate from and superior to. And so in doing so and looking at these kinds of diagrams, I also ask deep questions then about race, about our sexualities, our abilities, right, which aren't necessarily depicted in this, but are closely associated and interrelated with how we see the world. And it's often more complex than just these two, but it's a heuristic for visualizing and having out not only in research, but in learning spaces. So then really important to that work is in the framework that I work from in research and do my teaching from or engage in praxis is a really important concept I feel I can visualize here in this kind of always changing graphical representation of what ecofeminist philosopher Val Plumwood offers as the illusion of disembeddedness, and talks about this sort of extreme symptom of human-centered worldview where individuals begin to see themselves as separate from and superior to, get incredibly isolating in terms of an individual I, or the autonomous individual with privilege and power, and in sort of dominant politics right now, we could say the sort of white, able-bodied, heterosexual, male identifying person experiences the world in many ways as separate from and superior to all other things. And this is incredibly dangerous, right? We see this as independence, and then we begin to measure everything or understand all relationships in relationship to this really problematic false. I like how the philosopher really puts all these proofs forward for there is no proof for an independent, autonomous individual, okay, ecologically or culturally. I always play a game with my students and with other researchers who say, no, but Johnny, there are individuals. So we have individuality. We all have uniqueness and difference amongst us, but there is no case for the autonomous individual. And even when they play the game of trying to come up with one, I say, so they were never born of any kind of parent or belong to any kind of larger group. They don't have a language that they share or speak, right? We are all interrelated and interdependent, right? So remember, nothing comes into its existence outside of its relationship to something else, difference being sort of that core element. And so we're looking all the time at how these assumed relational structures undermine our abilities to put to practice addressing and eliminating racism, put to practice addressing and eliminating sexism. If we do so, understanding our relationships to each other as separate from and superior to, we're constantly undermining what we're learning or we're hoping to set goals to do. All right, so this isn't just to isolate people whose political views are incredibly racist and sexist. We know about those. This is to sort of have some humility to our own shortcomings in a culture that often sets us up to fail at these goals. So then I boil that down in my research to kind of a cycle, especially for research methods and research design. How are we engaging in an ongoing cycle to resist, to recognize, resist, and reconstitute? We don't have to call it this, but this is where I come back to all research is political. And so when I begin to talk about the politics of all of our research, I say, how do we collaborate on examining particular phenomena or practices in classrooms or in schools or in our communities that identify either the dominant discourses or the patterns or the habits, right? We're accountable to these. We resist them in some form, right? We find problematic ways in which they're undermining our goals, vis-a-vis democracy, if that's a goal, human rights, right? These kinds of things. We resist them. We work to reconstitute practices, to replace them with something that we've researched to be less harmful, to be supportive of these goals, right? And then this is ongoing. We're constantly working together to recognize, resist, and reconstitute. So let me get back to my notes. I'm toggling between notes and PowerPoint. This work spans a variety of projects, and most recently put to practice for me in critical discourse analysis of accountability standards in assessment documents in school districts to recognize the ways that those logic of dominations that we looked at, right, are deeply undergirding our assessment and accountability measures. Another example is working with a team of discourse analysis researchers to examine films and video games that offer hopeful opportunities for recognizing, resisting, and reconstituting how we teach and structure our schools and classrooms. Another example is partnering with abolitionist educators to examine the ways food systems in our schools contribute to maintaining white supremacy and an illusion of disembeddedness, poisoning and imprisoning our youth. So then in companion with that kind of study, that food study, I was able to collaborate further with qualitative researchers through this same framework to address strengths and challenges in youth participatory research methods in urban schools. And so another example is in a large qualitative study to examine the way speciesism, right, this idea that humans are separate from and superior to all other species, is taught in curriculum materials and contributes to reinforcing other forms of systemic oppression and is budding into, and that work is now budding into a multi-site, multi-species school ethnography. We're beginning to really look at the interrelated ways that racism, sexism, ableism, and I'm missing some here, right? The list goes on, but we come together to kind of piece these together and to say, how are our beliefs about who we are as human beings undergirding our abilities and success to be addressing these injustices? So in conclusion, the more that education researchers engage in diverse research towards more just and sustainable futures, the idea is that the more pedagogical models we will have that encourage the recognition of and resistance to all these forms of domination. Furthermore, the more potential there will be for research that supports educational experiences that foster spaces where teachers and students are learning together to recognize the harmful assumptions and actions that undergird social and ecological injustices. Well, on the one hand, I admire, value, and I'm a firm supporter of a shared commitment to respond to the undeniable atrocities that we as humans enact on one another, like where I highlight how important anti-racist pedagogies are to just futures. These atrocities are inextricably connected to the cruelties we perpetuate against non-human animals and the environment. None of these atrocities, whether we're addressing sexism in schools, racism, classism, none of these atrocities occur in isolation. They are all interconnected. So here's where I'll push often my colleagues and co-conspirators in research to take the uncomfortable step to confront human supremacy together with other forms of supremacy in education. In doing so, it's paramount that education researchers of this kind of work are really committed allies or accomplices to those suffering while challenging and confronting the systemic roots of oppression on our respective fronts. In other words, in my experience working often with environmental activists or researchers in critical environmental education, there's this sort of competition between advocating for justice in environmental communities and advocating for justice in human communities, as though there's some sort of separation between these communities. And I'm not saying that it does, like we're not competing often for resources. I'm calling for where we can begin to really work together instead of against one another. Even when in talking the talk, we're often saying, well, we're working on environmental issues, but it's really important also that we work on social issues. I think these two things have to come together really explicitly. And that doesn't mean don't go deeply individually in these areas, but do some of that important cross-supportive work. So in responding to enclosures of schooling by connecting the systemic roots of a particular kind of human-centered worldview to racism, sexism, classism, ableism, and so on, it requires that attention be turned toward the difficult necessity for cultural change. This is different than the kind of siloed work we often do. So it's my firm belief that as we imagine research as activist scholar educators, that if we do not rethink the cultural framework rooted deeply in our language by which dominant meanings are socially constructed, then we are destined to recreate and perpetuate many of the problematic relationships that we as radical educators often set out to change. Inspired by movements to address unjust suffering for our human and more than human kin, I'm suggesting that it is of utmost importance that as researchers, we listen to and learn from social movements and with the activist leaders like the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Women's Revolution in Rojava, water protectors on occupied native territories, together with taking some actual steps in our studies and enactments of pedagogies in our classroom towards cultural change. So although I recognize the importance of localized responses and understandings, I'll make a few bullet-pointed suggestions and then we'll turn to conversation. First suggestion is that scholar activist research engage in research that explores diverse projects to rethink the dominant assumptions, influencing how we as humans construct meaning, and thus how we learn to relate to each other and the more than human world. I frame that in inquiry. What does it mean to refer to something like natural gas and oil reserves as natural resources? What are we ignoring when we commodify the environment? What language further perpetuates social inequalities and undermines human rights and in our communities? What does it mean to be human beings in our research and our diverse communities of life? Who benefits and who and what suffers? How is our research influenced by cultural assumptions that are deeply political and undermine our efforts? The next bullet point that I really emphasize is engage in critical and ethical examinations of community. There's this sort of stigma around critical, that it means like be angry, or it means, you know, pick on or pick apart. And while it does means do some deconstruction, I like to call it means to negate and create, to recognize, resist, and reconstitute. It's a generative process. It has a stigmatization of just being like, we find take issue with and end there. And that's like the irresponsible sort of stereotype of critical. Engage in critical generative ethical examinations of community, asking questions like who and what might we be ignoring when we think about who is considered in the decisions we're making in our research, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our classrooms, right? Include in this, how are we learning from animals, plants, and systems that move beyond human to human relationships? And then also, where are there deep knowledges of this kind of learning? Because it exists, often to oversimplify it, in indigenous learning models. The next one here is to examine our research communities in terms of inclusion and the diverse ways in which our living relationships can be recognized, respected, and represented through listening and learning from and among all members, right? I just boil this down to, how do we partner and learn from and with social movements right now? And with that, ecological movements. How are we responsive to and learning from the Black Lives Matter in Schools movement? How are we responding to the resistance efforts in Rojava? How are we learning from indigenous water protectors, or even learning from the forests and waterways of our local communities, or the mycelial networks, right? Engage in supporting the diverse approaches to taking up resistance and healing from Western industrial culture, and in solidarity show respect for epistemologies that differ from the current dominant discourses of Western industrial culture. So above all, in addition to attempts to disrupt systemic oppression that is perpetuated through and within educational spaces at the individual level, we can also commit to the daily effort of making critical friends with other humans and non-human animals, engaging with our adversaries, inviting to conversations, having dialogues, and sharing stories of hope and resilience while creating local and international relationships that question and problematize assumed normalcies around domination and hierarchy. In such volatile authoritarian times, I mean, there's no doubt about it. We can debate it or set up separate conversations to talk about if our democracy is in trouble or not. It's on life support, right? And I don't want to be sensationalizing it. I used to go by a phrase. They used to always say, you got to prepare because when the devil comes to the door, and I'll tell you, like, that is not an existential threat anymore. The devil is at the door, okay? So whether it's climate change or whether it's white supremacy or whether it's like the denial of sort of good science and things, we're at a big precipice moment for humanity. And so as researchers, I turn us back towards Baldwin and emphasize in his talk to teachers, to our peers, to our students, to those of us, most of us identify, even though we're researchers, we're also teachers. Baldwin said, the obligation of anyone who thinks of themselves as responsible is to examine society and try to change it and fight it at no matter what risk. This is the only hope society has. This is the only way societies change. And so on that note, questions, conversations, discussions.
Johnny, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. That's wonderful. I think if you'd like to, you can call on people if they raise their hand or put forward. Let me just start with maybe an easy question for you to get us going. You talk about a critique of individuality, and you sort of said a few things about that.
Yeah.
Individuality is very important in Western child development. It's very important in how we judge research and one's contribution to research. How do you deal with that? Those sort of countervailing trends and forces about individuality.
Yeah, let me, and I probably misspoke, but there's a distinction I need to make, and it's a good clarifying question. I want to highlight, I take deep issue with individualism. sort of with a capital I, this notion of an autonomous individual. So it rooted in certain parts of Western philosophy that I actually think get kind of cherry picked, right? So, I like to really take apart Descartes and all the sort of dudes of Western science, but I think they're also cherry picked in some unscholarly ways. We can get into that a separate time. But this notion of the autonomous individual as the capital I, separate from and superior to all other things, is what I take deep issue with. This false illusion that anyone exists separate from anything else. And so individuality or uniqueness or differentiation is an incredibly important concept. And this is also where I come to where we have to like critically engage in our language, right? Because that word like individuality and individualism is so close. So celebrating difference is key, right? Diversity is a condition of difference upon which everything exists. So holding in high value the importance of difference, diversity, right? And that's also not to romanticize that everything is healthy or okay or good, right? We don't want to over romanticize diversity, but we don't want to abhor diversity because there's some bad parts to recognizing it. Does this make sense? So differentiation and individuality is incredibly important. But then I want to really problematize the way that individualism and individuality merge, right? And so they often merge and then they manifest in sort of the way we do evaluation, the way we do measurement, the way we see independence as success and dependency as a problem. And we even have language for this in English, right? Or in sort of Western kind of ideas we call like dependency as like codependency, as though it's bad. And certainly I work all the time with folks who do counseling work, and I'm teasing that apart because I think it's incredibly important tools that we can recognize and value our interrelated or our interdependencies without being unhealthily dependent on one another or our ecosystem. And this is also where I think an ecological model shows us how this, like healthy bioregions teach us this, right? There are diverse species that have modeled this for centuries and centuries and centuries, and mature cultures who have lived in accordance with this knowledge system, right? So that's where I'm sort of picking on that individuality and individualism to sort of debunk this notion that any of us exists outside of our relationship to one another and to diverse species. Does that help make sense?
Yeah, that's a big help, Johnny.
But this is key. This is cool in the research. So we're looking at where does individualism manifest itself or exist in curriculum materials and metaphors we teach to, or standards that we set for our classrooms.
Yes, thank you.
I mean, we're asking young people all the time to be democratic citizens, but structuring things in very undemocratic ways, right? That's your jam, AG. Dewey taught us a lot about that, right?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Thank you, Johnny. Others, please just raise your hand or just shout out a question to Johnny.
Hey, John.
Hey, everyone. Oh, go ahead, Celestina.
Celestina, then Jessica. Go ahead.
Great,
Celestina.
thanks. No, I just wanted to thank you, John. This was fascinating to hear. I'll just speak for myself. I haven't heard a lot of this dialogue in the health sciences. I think that really calls to the need for across college participation in things like that. We're educators here, of course, in our colleges, but we don't have this background at all. And as we saw play out this year, a tweet from JAMA saying that no physician is racist. So how can there be structural racism in healthcare? That's where we're at here. You know what I mean? And then so to hear something like this, and even just your comment that all research is political, is like, that's not what we're hearing in our disciplines, And so it's just been great. This has been really enlightening. I'm blown away by what you all are, by what you have access to with one another and all of that. And just wanted to let you know, I'm going to try to get as many as my colleagues to attend this, and just really a plug for relationships across colleges and across campuses. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. If it's not interdisciplinary, and I share a whole other bit that I cut out about the uniqueness of my research training is actually in a hybrid program that emerged out of a direct need in Detroit, where they said, we need nurses, we need teachers, we need community organizers, church leaders, youth group programmers. We need all hands on deck. Anyone whose hands are in the pot of mixing the stew of how do we make this a healthier place for everybody to live and stay. The goal not being how do we get these kids out of Detroit, but how do they become agents of change for a different, just future of Detroit. And they designed a whole PhD research community program around that. And it was unique because it was interdisciplinary in these ways. And we share this. And Celestina, just to mirror back, education, we're in the same place. I mean, so that's why I call for Baldwin saying like, we have to go for broke if we recognize these injustices. If we know too much and owe too much, then we go for it. Because we're in the same world. Florida has just given a statement out to say, for us math educators, right, that no politics should be included in math instruction, and any curriculum materials that include anything about social justice or diversity are not to be used in classrooms, because research shows that it's not in best practices for math ed. And I got math ed folks here who can show that that's not true. But then that's what we're up against, is that we're fighting for what we know will help not only our democracy survive this moment, but thrive, right? And it's our young children learning that you learn mathematics while you're also learning to be the kind of people that can make democratic decisions, right? And so these kinds of pieces together. Yeah, Dave Slavitz here to say that is BS to say it crudely, but that's the kind of world we're in, with tweets and with, misinformation, and also for all of us. I mean, I don't want to use a metaphor of fight, right? It's not always the best metaphor, but the idea is like, those are fighting words. We do research, and you can't just tweet that research shows that, because then we got to be like, wait, hold up. What research? Scientific consensus, and we're all scientists in a sense. Scientific consensus shows something very different, right? And we're seeing this in patterns, right? With anti-vax conversations, with white supremacist conversations, with, sexism and misogynistic conversation. I mean, we're fighting for reproductive rights in states right now. And it's just like, so we're together in this, and we're not necessarily further along. WSU has just cherry picked a lot of us who have common interests and put us together to incubate this stuff. And so we're glad that we work together with you, Celestina.
Thank you, Celestina. Jessica has a question. There's also a question from Kaylee in the chat, Johnny. So okay. Jessica, go ahead, and then Kaylee, you can ask your question, or Johnny can just respond to your chat if you'd like.
Yeah, Jessica, ask your question.
All right, Johnny, that was fabulous. Reminded me, I was listening to the takeaway, it was like maybe last week, and there was a climate activist on who said, how are we not all out in the streets right now? How are we not all taking, big action? And that really made me think, like, man, I really, I saw myself in that for sure. And then I thought about my own research, which is more focused on literacies and schools. And I was thinking, I gotta weave in climate justice, which of course is not separate at all from racism, sexism, classism, ableism, et cetera. And that's such a beautiful point that you illustrated for us. And I love the idea too of just kind of working comprehensively, with regard to like issues of injustice. My question is if you can speak to maybe what that looks like specifically around like the reconstituting phase of your own sort of methodology and your own praxis. I think that's kind of where, as a new researcher, as a tenure track person, I'm struggling. So I don't know if you have any words to share about the reconstitution.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that question. And then I'll loop it into the ones in the chat, because they're very related. I'm just going to step out of kind of typical descriptors we use in research and just talk about, in a group of scholar activist researchers, we start to shift the language, right, around what does it mean to be a scholar activist educator, to engage as research as praxis, right? Most of us in education research I don't want to make assumptions, are teachers first. And I'm not prioritizing that. It's just like we identify as like we're doing the research to improve education. That's what draws us to it. Or we're health practitioners because we see the need for a healthier community, and we gain skill and knowledge that we want to put to practice for good use. Whether we're designing assessments, I really feel like I work on a diverse team that's all sort of on the same team when it comes down to it. But when we get into the weeds of like self-reflecting on our, like recognizing, resisting, and reconstituting in our own research methods and our own work, I find that it's incredibly important to sort of ask questions around hubris and humility, right? And how are we able to say too often, because of the sort of bad habits of Western industrial academia, we're positioned, especially pre-tenure or in tenure, and it's always kind of a climbing hierarchy, to position ourselves with hubris, to meet one another in ways that undermine collaboration, even when we're collaborating, right? And I think my colleagues do a wonderful job of working through this without having to name it and work through it. But I think the more we're intentional about it, we build practices around our humility to falsifiability, where I can say, I'm doing really good work, but what would it mean if it was wrong? Or if someone was being unnecessarily harmed, or maybe it wasn't the best practice, instead of having to like constantly defend a position, right? I'm working into a regular practice. How might I be falling short? What might be some things that are undermining this work? Where do I have learning to do? What might I learn to do differently? Kind of a good example, I think most of us more recently, I'm seeing, and I'm not trying to call out anyone who doesn't do this, but I'm seeing pronouns in the names. This is newer learning for some of us, even in the critical social justice world. You know, we learned, you know, there are two genders, and there is, you know, male identifying and female identifying. In fact, we actually learned about as masculinity and femininity and all this sort of really important ways to addressing patriarchy, but that we learned even more as we brought sort of humility to our work, or what I kind of have been drawing on, this idea of humility to falsifiability. Like, I can be wrong, it's okay. What do I do when recognizing and hearing the ways I'm wrong? And I often teach this not only as a researcher, but to folks who share similar privileges as myself, right? I'm white guy, right? White male, settler colonial. I say, if you're not coming to the work with some humility, then you're more of a problem than you are an asset. So we got work to do, right? Come on, we got work to do. And I call them over sort of like small group work. I do, we do, you do, right? Let's work together just like we would in a classroom. Okay, recognize where the way you see the world might not be the healthiest way. Now, what do we do about it, right? Same thing with our research practices. So it's constantly listening and learning from people who do diverse kinds of research, not appropriating it, not trying to do it, but then asking deep questions of, so what are the research things I do? And how do I contribute to the larger goal that education research is sharing, right? So you're kind of always grappling with that. And so like pre-tenure, there's this like constant poisoning of hubris that we're going to tell you. We're like, no, you have to have an ego. You have to do this, right? But at the same time, we have to have a practice of being like, there is humility to falsifiability that's part of that bad habit of hubris. So it's a little bit of balancing both. Is that helpful? Really quick, looping through the chat. Let's have a whole nother conversation around capitalism, because I think liberating economic structures and community life from capitalism, like you can have economics without capitalism. Yes, and those are places I would say like communities that aren't so steeped in the kind of hyper neoliberal capitalism that we're in, don't have as much, they're more defending themselves against being taken over by that than they are indoctrinated by that. It's the only way to live, right? That's the myth. The only way to do economics is through neoliberal capitalism. And that's the myth. And I'll blame, even though it's deeper than that, I like to pick on Margaret Thatcher. And I was like, man, when that lady said there's no other alternatives, they were like, what about neoliberal economics? There's no other alternatives. And I was like, that's gangster, lady. You don't get to just look me in the face. That's like when we say, when the students say, why are we learning this? And we say, because I said so. That's not going to work. But it does kind of work in a really powerful way. And it did work economically with neoliberalism. So a whole separate thing. But yes, finding alternatives to capitalism are really helpful. And okay, I'm going to share something that comes out of critical pedagogy, but it's the best strategy I have for the question Nicole poses. And we can talk more about it because I think it's the real work. It's relational. Donaldo Macedo, who's a student and colleague of Paulo Freire, was working with us in Detroit and said to us, critical pedagogy, real simply, and again, he's going to use big words most of us use in our work, so I'll use them here, is ontologically comforting and epistemologically shattering. We say, come, let's eat together. Let's become friends, but critical friends, ones that hold one another accountable and learn together. So with family members or with people in our community who think differently to this, I say, hey, how are you? Let's get to know one another. What are the things you love and value about our community and in our lives together? And how do we develop a relationship that is, as a teacher or a researcher, ontologically welcoming and comforting? But then it's going to have some moments of epistemological discomfort. And this is what's at threat in our schools right now when legislation is saying you can't teach anything that might be uncomfortable. We know one, and my man Sammy Perrone is not here right now, but he could help anchor us in this. And there's plenty of educational psychologists in this room and development scholars who can say, I mean, zone of proximal development is based on we get a little bit uncomfortable in ontologically comforting ways, but that's where we learn, when we're supported to be pushed a little bit. And I think this is key. Too often, hubris takes over and we're like, I can't even be around these people who think differently than me. And especially as researchers, we sort of get in our silos that way. How could people not see that classroom management could be more engaging and less punitive, right? And we say, hey, tell me about what you love about teaching. How might we learn together to teach differently? Ha-ha. Here's a little bit of something uncomfortable we might try. Let's center our classroom around children's rights, right? And now all of a sudden children have voice. Oh, it's like all these things that are probably epistemologically a little bit uncomfortable, but held in an ontologically comforting way. Thank you, Catherine. I know we're over time, so I don't want to hog it all.
Much, Johnny. That was great. We need to respect people's time, and we just got going. But we can continue these conversations, and you've set us off in a good way in our first research conversation.
Okay.
Thanks to Shola and Laura. I love working with them and working with you. And I believe our next research conversation is Ann Cox.
Yes.
Coming up, and that will be wonderful. We'll get more information out about that too. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.